There is a place in Jerusalem that has been walked over, built upon, argued over, prayed over, and fought over for 2,000 years. Pilgrims weep on its stones. Armies have bled into its soil. Entire religions have organized themselves around what happened there. And yet, nobody agrees on where it actually is. The name is Golgotha. And if you've heard of it at all, you probably think you know what it means. The place of the skull. The hill shaped like a skull. The rocky outcrop outside the city walls where Rome performed its executions and Jesus of Nazareth was crucified between two criminals on a Friday afternoon in the 1st century. You've seen the paintings, you've seen the films, the dramatic hilltop. 3 crosses silhouetted against a darkening sky. The crowd below, the soldiers. But here's what nobody tells you. That image is almost entirely wrong. Not just the details, not just the Hollywood embellishments. The fundamental picture, the hill, the isolation, the theatrical staging, is not supported by the archaeological record. And when you strip that image away, when you begin actually looking at the evidence, the location known as Golgotha turns out to be something far stranger than a hill. Something older, something darker, something that was chosen very deliberately, for reasons that go far beyond Roman logistics. There is a secret buried in this place, several of them, actually, and they have been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years, hiding inside the meaning of a single word. We're going to dig into all of it. But I need to start with something that most documentaries about the crucifixion never bother to establish: the specific geography of 1st century Jerusalem. Because without it, nothing about Golgotha makes any sense. Jerusalem in the year 30 CE was not the sprawling city it would later become. It was a dense, walled urban center of roughly 60 to 80,000 inhabitants, built on a series of hills, the city of David to the south, the Temple Mount to the east, the upper city to the west. The entire urban footprint was surrounded by a series of walls, and the placement of those walls is critical because Jewish law and Roman custom both required that executions happen outside the city. The dead could not contaminate the living. Execution grounds, tombs, and places of defilement had to be kept beyond the gates. So Golgotha was outside Jerusalem's walls. That much all 4 Gospels agree on. John 19:20 specifies that the place was near the city. Matthew 27:32 describes Jesus being led out of the city toward it. Hebrews 13:12 explicitly states that Jesus suffered outside the gate. The writer of Hebrews knows this detail matters theologically. We'll come back to why. What we need to establish first is the physical terrain. The northwestern side of Jerusalem in the 1st century contained something that most people never picture when they imagine the crucifixion site: a quarry. A large, old, partially exhausted limestone quarry that had been worked for centuries before Jesus was born. This matters enormously. The quarry had created a distinctive landscape, an uneven, rocky terrain pocked with hollows, channels cut into the stone, steep faces where limestone had been extracted, and abandoned sections where the rock quality was too poor to be useful. These abandoned sections had, over time, become something else: gardens, tombs, burial chambers cut into the quarry walls by wealthy families who wanted space outside the busy city. John's Gospel, which is consistently the most specific about geographical details, notes in chapter 19, verse 41, that in the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. A garden, adjacent to the execution site. That's not a random detail. That's archaeological context. The presence of a garden tells you that parts of this quarry had been filled in with topsoil and cultivated. a common repurposing of exhausted quarry land in the ancient Mediterranean world. And the presence of tomb chambers cut into nearby rock faces is exactly what you'd expect from a first-century Jewish burial site in an area of soft limestone. We're not talking about a dramatic hilltop. We're talking about a former industrial site on the outskirts of the city, gritty, functional, marked by human extraction and abandonment. And somewhere within it, or adjacent to it, was a specific place called Golgotha. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because the word Golgotha, the Aramaic word used in 3 of the 4 Gospels, does not mean hill of the skull. It means simply skull, or the skull. The Aramaic root is Golgotha. The Greek transliteration is Golgotha, and every ancient source that translates it renders it the same way. Cranion in Greek, Calvaria in Latin, skull. Not skull-shaped, not skull hill, just skull. So the question every serious scholar eventually has to ask is, why was this place called the skull? There are 4 competing answers, and each one, if you follow it carefully, leads somewhere unexpected. The first answer is the one most people have heard. The place had a rocky formation that looked like a skull, a prominent outcrop of limestone with eye socket-shaped caves, a curved top, a general resemblance to a human cranium when viewed from the right angle. This is the explanation promoted most aggressively by a site called Gordon's Calvary, or the Garden Tomb, which sits just north of the old city's Damascus Gate. In 1883, a British general named Charles George Gordon became convinced that a rocky cliff face near the Damascus Gate, featuring 2 cave-like hollows that could plausibly be read as eye sockets, was the actual site of the crucifixion. The location also has a garden. It has ancient tombs. It checks certain boxes. And it is, by all archaeological consensus, almost certainly wrong. Not because the cliff face isn't evocative. It is. Not because the garden and tombs aren't authentic. They are ancient. But because the geological and historical evidence consistently points elsewhere. And because the skull-shaped outcrop explanation, for all its visual appeal, doesn't hold up when you look at how the word is actually used in ancient texts. The second answer is institutional and archaeological. Golgotha is identified by the vast majority of scholars and archaeologists with a site now enclosed within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Christian quarter of Jerusalem's Old City. That identification goes back to the year 325 CE, when the Roman Emperor Constantine ordered an investigation into the location of the crucifixion and burial. The investigation found a site that had been deliberately built over, buried under a pagan temple to Venus, constructed by the Emperor Hadrian around 135 CE, when he rebuilt Jerusalem as the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina. According to the 4th century bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, who was present for the excavation, workers demolished Hadrian's temple and found beneath it a cave that Christians identified as the tomb of Jesus. Hadrian's construction, ironically, had preserved the site. The temple platform had sealed the underlying topography in place. The excavations conducted in the 20th century within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre revealed something important. Beneath the church floor, there are remnants of the ancient quarry. Rock faces, a disused section of limestone that was deemed too poor to quarry, and a 1st century Jewish tomb. The site is genuine. The archaeology is consistent. The tomb cut into the rock, the garden terracing, the proximity to what was the northwestern gate of 1st century Jerusalem. It all fits. But here's the problem. Here's the piece that the tour guides and the pilgrimage pamphlets almost never stop to explain. If the Church of the Holy Sepulchre sits on the actual site of Golgotha, and the evidence strongly suggests it does, then the place where Jesus was crucified was not a dramatic hilltop outside the city. It was a low, rocky outcrop, barely elevated, perhaps 7 or 8 meters above the surrounding terrain at most. Not a hill in any meaningful topographic sense. A rocky bump in the middle of an old quarry, just outside the city gate, in a location that would have been visible to people passing along the road, which was exactly what Roman execution protocol required. Rome didn't crucify people in isolated theatrical locations. Rome crucified people where traffic was heavy, where the maximum number of witnesses could observe the penalty for challenging imperial authority. The roadside, the city gate, the public approach. Golgotha wasn't chosen because it was scenic. It was chosen because it was unavoidable. And now we need to stop and address the third explanation for the name. Because this one is not about geography, it's about something much older. In Jewish tradition, specifically in texts from the Second Temple period and later rabbinical commentary, there is a persistent belief that the skull buried at Golgotha was a real skull, the skull of Adam. This tradition appears in multiple ancient sources. The 3rd century church father Origen references it. The apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus contains it. Rabbinical midrash sources engage with it, and it shows up repeatedly in early Christian art. If you look carefully at medieval paintings of the crucifixion, you will frequently see, at the base of the cross, a skull partially buried in the earth. That skull, in the iconographic tradition, is Adam's. The theological weight of this tradition is staggering. Think about what it claims. The first human, the one whose disobedience, according to Genesis 3, introduced death and suffering into creation, is buried in the exact spot where the one who Christians believe reversed that disobedience would himself die. Blood of the second Adam falling on the skull of the first. Whether or not the tradition is historically accurate is almost beside the point. The fact that ancient communities believed it and built their theological understanding of the crucifixion around it tells us something crucial about how Golgotha was understood. This was not random geography. This was, in the imagination of the ancient world, the axis of salvation history. The place where the oldest wound and its cure converged. But where did the tradition come from? What gave rise to the idea that Adam was buried there? Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, mentions that Adam's burial site was in Hebron. But there are other traditions, and what those other traditions point to is something that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The name Golgotha, the skull, may have nothing to do with a skull-shaped rock formation and everything to do with what this place was used for. In the 1st century, outside the walls of Jerusalem, one of the designated functions of the ground adjacent to the execution site was the disposal of the bones of the executed. Crucifixion victims who had no family to claim their bodies were not buried. They were left to decompose on the cross. When the remains were eventually taken down, after days, sometimes weeks, they were cast into a pit or left in the open air. Skulls, specifically, accumulate. They don't decay as quickly as soft tissue. They persist in the landscape. A place where executions happen regularly, over decades and generations, will accumulate skulls. And a place known for its accumulated human remains, the visible, grim evidence of Roman justice, could very naturally come to be called the skull. This is not a pleasant explanation, but it is consistent with both the name and with what we know about Roman execution sites. The Via Appia outside Rome was lined with crucifixion poles. Travelers passed through a corridor of death. The landscape of Roman justice was deliberately, systematically grotesque. Golgotha, on the northwestern approach to Jerusalem, may have served precisely this function. If that's true, and a growing number of scholars believe it is, Then the place where Jesus was crucified wasn't chosen because of any skull-shaped hill. It was chosen because it was already a place of skulls. Because the ground itself was a public declaration of what Rome did to people who stepped out of line. Jesus was executed in the empire's open-air museum of consequences. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters for what comes next. And if this is the first time you're hearing the real archaeology behind Golgotha, I want you to share this with someone, because this is the kind of history that changes how you read the story. Stay with us. We're only beginning to dig. Let's go deeper into the competing sites. Because the Gordon's Calvary debate isn't just an academic footnote. It tells you something important about how badly we want Golgotha to look a certain way. General Gordon arrived in Jerusalem in 1883 with a mystical bent and a conviction that sacred geography had to be legible. He looked at the rocky outcrop north of the Damascus Gate, and he saw what he needed to see: the hollowed caves, the rounded summit, the skull-like face of the cliff. He mapped his vision onto the terrain, and the vision was beautiful, orderly, dramatically satisfying. The Garden Tomb nearby was excavated in 1867 by Conrad Schick and found to be a genuine ancient Jewish burial site. 2 chambers, a carved trough for a body, a rolling stone groove at the entrance. Gordon and his successors declared it the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea in which Jesus was laid. Pilgrims visit it today in enormous numbers. It is quiet, it is green, it has the garden that John's Gospel describes. It feels, unmistakably, like a place where something sacred could have happened. But the archaeology is unambiguous in its dating. The tomb at Gordon's Calvary is an Iron Age tomb, consistent with a date somewhere between 700 and 500 BCE. It does not match the description in John's Gospel of a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. An Iron Age family tomb, used for generations and then abandoned, is not a new tomb in the 1st century CE. Whatever it was not that. And the skull-faced cliff? The geological surveys done in the 20th century established that its current appearance is largely the product of centuries of quarrying and erosion that post-date the 1st century. The hollow eye socket caves were not natural features of the landscape in the year 30. They were created by later stone extraction and the collapse of softer rock. Gordon saw what the tradition told him to see. The tradition itself was looking for something it had already decided was there. This is not unusual. It's actually one of the most consistent patterns in the history of biblical archaeology. The desire for Golgotha to be dramatic, elevated, isolated, and visually arresting has shaped every attempt to locate it. Because we've been looking for the hill from the paintings, the theatrical hilltop under a darkening sky. And what the evidence keeps giving us, stubbornly and consistently, is a quarry. An exhausted, abandoned, unbeautiful quarry outside the city gate. I want you to sit with the discomfort of that for a moment. Because the discomfort is informative. We have constructed, over 2,000 years, an image of Golgotha that is about grandeur and drama. The hill, the height, the visibility, the cosmic scale of what happened there, translated into a landscape that matches it. But the cosmic scale, if you believe it, was not in the landscape. It was in the event, and the event happened in a quarry. There is a reason the letter to the Hebrews makes the point it makes. Let us go to him outside the camp, not up to the hill, not to the elevated place, outside, to the excluded ground, to the wrong side of the gate. The instruction is not to seek the dramatic location. It is to seek the discarded one. The theology of Golgotha begins and insists on staying in the place most people would rather not go. Now, I want to talk about something that is not discussed enough in the standard treatments of the crucifixion. The specific sensory reality of what an execution site in the 1st century smelled like, sounded like, and looked like in the weeks and months surrounding any given crucifixion. Because Golgotha was not a site used once, it was a site used repeatedly, over what appears to have been an extended period of time as Rome's primary execution location in the Jerusalem vicinity. Josephus, in his Wars of the Jews, describes the period immediately before and during the siege of Jerusalem in 66 to 70 CE. He writes that the Roman general Titus had prisoners crucified in view of the city walls, 500 per day at one point, until the soldiers ran out of wood for crosses and space for execution poles. The landscape around Jerusalem in this period was, by Josephus's account, covered with crosses. That is an extreme period, not the typical situation decades earlier, but it illustrates the operational reality of a Roman execution site. Crucifixion was not a rare, solemnly conducted event. It was industrial in its frequency. The site at Golgotha, over the years of Roman occupation, would have processed dozens, if not hundreds, of condemned individuals. What that means for the physical landscape is specific and grim. The ground retains what happens on it. The bones of those who were not claimed accumulate. The soil absorbs blood. The wood of the crosses rots and is replaced. The carrion birds become a permanent feature of the site's ecology. This is the place the 4 Gospels describe, with the simple phrase, "And they brought him to Golgotha." No elaboration, no description of horror, just the name. The name, by the 1st century, would have been enough. Everyone who heard it would have known exactly what it was. The place of skulls. Not a place you chose to go, a place you were brought to. And now consider this. The women who stood at the foot of the cross, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and in John's account the mother of Jesus herself, stood in that place voluntarily, not brought, not compelled, standing in a Roman execution site, in a place of accumulated death, outside the gate, in the ground of the cursed. That act of standing, that willingness to be present in the most excluded place, at the side of the most publicly condemned man, is doing something that the theology of the New Testament will later try to articulate, but which the women perform, physically and without commentary, before anyone has had time to think it through. They go outside the gate, before anyone tells them to. Let's go deeper into the geology, because the limestone beneath Jerusalem holds its own testimony. The quarry that underlies the Golgotha site was worked from at least the 8th century BCE, possibly earlier. Archaeologist Gabriel Barquet, who has done extensive work on the burial caves of Jerusalem, estimates that the quarry may have been in active use for as long as 7 centuries before Jesus was born. The stone it produced, a relatively soft, workable limestone, was used in the construction of Iron Age Jerusalem, Herodian Jerusalem, and everything in between. When a section of quarry is exhausted, when the usable stone runs out, it gets abandoned. Weeds grow in the cuts. Rainwater collects in the channels. Families move in to cut burial niches into the remaining walls because soft limestone is easy to work, and a disused quarry offers privacy and protection from the elements. This is exactly what the archaeological record at the Holy Sepulchre site shows. A section of quarry that was worked, then abandoned, then partially converted into garden terracing and tomb chambers. Precisely the combination that John's Gospel describes. Now, here is the detail that I want you to hold on to. Among the rock features of the Holy Sepulchre site, there is a section of limestone bedrock that was not quarried. Not because nobody tried. The tool marks are there, in the rock. showing that workers began to cut into this outcrop and then stopped. They stopped because the stone is of inferior quality. It's fissured, fractured in ways that make it unsuitable for construction. This rejected section of rock, too broken to be useful, became the place of execution. Matthew 27, verse 51, records something that happened the moment Jesus died on the cross. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Seismic activity in first-century Jerusalem is not in dispute. The region sits on active fault lines. Researchers Jefferson Williams, Marcus Schwab, and Achim Brauer published a study in 2012 in the International Geology Review examining sediment cores from the Dead Sea. They found evidence of two significant seismic events within the range of the crucifixion date. One around 2636 CE that matches the time frame of the Passion. But what's striking is the rock at Golgotha itself. The fractured, fissured limestone that made this section of quarry unworkable, the rock that was rejected by the stonecutters, became the place where the cross was planted. And if you visit the Chapel of Adam, in the lower level of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today, you can see, preserved behind protective glass, a crack in the bedrock directly beneath the traditional site of the crucifixion. The crack runs several meters. Its orientation is consistent with seismic activity. Whether it opened on the day of the crucifixion, or whether it was a pre-existing feature of the fissured rock that had long made this section of quarry unusable, cannot be determined with certainty. What can be said is this: the place of the skull was already broken before Jesus arrived. That is either a coincidence or it is not. But before we get there, I want to spend time on the Adam tradition in more detail, because it opens a door that most people don't know exists. And once you walk through it, the whole architecture of Golgotha looks different. The tradition is ancient. It predates Christianity. In Second Temple Jewish literature, the body of texts written roughly between 500 BCE and 100 CE, there are references to the belief that significant events in later Israelite history were somehow connected to the origins of human existence. The ground beneath Jerusalem was understood, in certain streams of Jewish thought, as having a special relationship with creation itself. The Temple Mount was believed to sit over the foundation stone, the Even HaShatia, from which the world was created, from which God had fashioned Adam. The geography of sacred space in Judaism was layered with primordial meaning. The specific claim that Adam's skull was buried at Golgotha emerges most clearly in Christian sources, but it draws on this broader Jewish instinct that sacred sites are not accidentally sacred. They are places where creation's origins and creation's destiny converge. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, reports the tradition and takes it seriously as an interpretation. He writes that in the place where Jesus was crucified, Adam was buried. He connects it to the passage in Ezekiel 38:12, which speaks of Jerusalem as sitting at the center of the earth, the navel of the world. If the center of the earth was also the beginning of the earth, then it was fitting that what began there, human life, human death, should also be resolved there. The apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus gives the tradition its fullest narrative form. In its account of the harrowing of hell, Adam speaks directly. He has been waiting, in the shadow of death, for precisely this moment. And the connection between his burial place and the place of the cross is not incidental. It is structural. John Chrysostom, one of the most influential preachers of the 4th century, engaged the tradition in his homilies on Matthew. He is cautious about its historical accuracy, but cannot resist its theological resonance. They say that Adam died there and was buried there, so that as death came by one man in that place, life also should spring up there. life springing up in the place of the original death, the precise geography of the reversal. Whether or not you believe it literally, whether or not the skull of the first human being is actually beneath the rock of Golgotha, the tradition tells you what the ancient world understood about this place. They did not understand it as a random execution hill on the outskirts of a provincial city. They understood it as the center of the moral universe. The place where the first catastrophe and its resolution were meant, had always been meant, to meet. That understanding shaped everything. It shaped the architecture of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which enclosed both the rock of Golgotha and the tomb of Jesus within the same building, death site and burial site together, because in the theological vision of the builders, they were inseparable. It shaped the iconography of every crucifix in the Western tradition, where the skull at the foot of the cross is not decoration, but argument. And it shaped the way the earliest Christians talked about what had happened there, not as tragedy interrupted by miracle, but as the completion of something that was set in motion at the very beginning of the world. This is the Golgotha you don't hear about. Not just an execution site, a site whose name, whose location, whose very geology was being read as a text written in stone and bone and broken limestone that the people of the first century knew how to interpret, and that we, 2,000 years later, have mostly forgotten how to read. Now I want to take you back to the question of location. Because there is a piece of this that has been quietly unsettling biblical scholars for decades, and it touches on something that goes well beyond archaeology. All four Gospels are specific. Golgotha was outside the city, but the precise boundary of outside depends entirely on where the walls were in the year 30 CE. Jerusalem's walls were not static. The city expanded. Walls were built, demolished, and rebuilt. Herod the Great, who died around 4 BCE, had expanded the city significantly. And according to Josephus, there was a third wall, a wall that Agrippa began building around 41 to 44 CE, that enclosed territory north and northwest of the city that had previously been outside the city limits. If Agrippa's third wall enclosed new territory after Jesus' death, then the Golgotha site would have been outside the walls in 30 CE, even if it later fell within them. The archaeological excavations beneath the Holy Sepulchre are consistent with this. The site shows evidence of being outside the city walls during the first century period most scholars associate with the crucifixion. But here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. In 2015, archaeologists working on a road construction project in Jerusalem's Christian quarter, just north of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, encountered ancient remains at a depth of several meters. Among the finds, a section of wall dated to the 1st century, and a carved stone threshold of a gate. The excavation team, led by Shlomit Wexler Badola, concluded that these were remains of the gate and city wall that Josephus called the second wall, the wall that, in the time of Jesus, marked the boundary between the city and the area that contained Golgotha. They were excavating, in other words, the gate through which Jesus walked when he carried the cross to the execution site. The distance from that gate to the traditional location of Golgotha within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is approximately 40 meters. 40 meters, the entire route of what Christians have traditionally called the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, compressed into a distance shorter than a city block. Not the long, agonizing processional through the city that popular imagination has constructed. Not the dramatic journey through narrow medieval streets that modern pilgrims walk today. A short, brutal march through a gate and into the death grounds just outside it. Rome was efficient. It didn't waste time. There's something almost unbearable about that compression. The enormity of the event, theologically, historically, culturally, set against the smallness of the physical reality. 40 meters, a quarry, a broken rock, an abandoned section of land on the wrong side of a gate. The whole of it, over in a matter of minutes of walking. Let's talk now about what crucifixion at this specific site would have looked like. Not the Hollywood version, the forensic version. The cross was not a towering structure. Artistic depictions consistently portray a cross that elevates the victim dramatically above the crowd, 10, 12, 15 feet in the air. This serves narrative purposes. It dramatizes the scene. It makes the crucified figure visible and dominant. In practice, Roman crucifixion poles were short. The feet of a crucified person were typically no more than 18 inches to 2 feet off the ground, close enough that animals, dogs, ravens, could reach the body. This was intentional. The indignity was the point. It also means that the confrontations described in the Gospels, the mocking from soldiers and passers-by, the thieves on either side speaking to Jesus, Jesus speaking to his mother, and the beloved disciple standing at the foot of the cross, were all happening in close physical proximity, not shouted up to a figure towering overhead, spoken to someone at roughly face level or just above. The crowd was close. The soldiers were close. The sound, breathing, weeping, the physical sounds of a dying body struggling to inhale would have been audible. John's Gospel tells us that a sign was posted above Jesus' head. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. John 19:20 notes that many Jews read the sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, not distant from it, near the road, near the gate. In a place where people passing in and out of Jerusalem would walk directly through, or past, the execution site. The 12 tribe leaders of Rome's provincial empire understood the grammar of public execution. You display the condemned in the most trafficked place available. You make the consequence visible. You write the crime above the head in every language the audience speaks. Jesus died at the side of the road, in a disused quarry, on a broken rock, near a gate. His death was not a private tragedy. It was a public announcement. And the place it happened had been accumulating the bones of the condemned for decades before he arrived. Now I want to bring you to the thing that I believe is the deepest secret Golgotha holds. Not a geographical secret, not an archaeological secret, a theological secret that is hiding inside the word itself, inside the location itself, inside the specific choice of this specific place. To understand it, you need to know one thing about Jewish law in the Second Temple period. The book of Leviticus, chapters 13 through 16, establishes a complex system of ritual purity and defilement. Certain conditions, contact with a corpse, with bodily fluids, with specific diseases, rendered a person ritually impure. And a ritually impure person could not enter the temple, could not participate in the sacrificial system, was, in a technical sense, outside the covenant community until the impurity was resolved through specific purification rites. The geography of first-century Jerusalem was organized around this principle. Everything that caused defilement was kept outside the walls. The dead were buried outside. The ritually impure were excluded outside. Execution, which involved blood, death, and the cursed state of the condemned, happened outside. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verse 23, is specific. Anyone hung on a pole is under God's curse. That verse, applied in the first century to crucifixion, meant that a person crucified was not merely legally condemned. They were ritually, theologically, cosmically cursed, cast outside the covenant, outside the camp, outside the gate. The author of Hebrews, writing in the late 1st century, seizes on this with extraordinary precision. chapter 13, verses 11 through 13. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Outside the gate, outside the camp, in the place of defilement, in the place of the cursed. This was not accidental. In the theological interpretation of the New Testament writers, the location of the crucifixion was part of its meaning. Jesus didn't die in spite of being taken outside the city. He died precisely because he was taken outside the city. The geography was the theology. To die at Golgotha, in the place of skulls, outside the gate, in the ground of the cursed, was to be identified with everything that the covenant excluded. And now, here is the twist that I don't think gets enough attention. The temple curtain. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record it. The moment Jesus dies, the curtain of the temple, the massive, heavily embroidered barrier that separated the outer courts from the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber where the presence of God was believed to dwell. Tears from top to bottom. The Holy of Holies was the most sacred space in the Jewish world. The highest priest, once per year, on the Day of Atonement, could enter it. No one else. It was the inner sanctum, the presence behind the veil, and the veil tears. What that image is doing, in the narrative of all three synoptic Gospels, is this. It is saying that the boundary between sacred and profane, between inside and outside, between the presence of God and the excluded and defiled, that boundary has been abolished. The man dies outside the gate, in the ground of the cursed, at the place of skulls. The curtain tears. The inside pours out to meet the outside. The place that was chosen to be maximally excluded from the sacred becomes, in the theology of the earliest Christians, the point of access to the sacred. The place of the skull, where bones accumulated and the cursed died, and execution was public, and the ground was broken and rejected, becomes, in this reading, the hinge of all of history. This is not an accident of location. It is a deliberate, devastating reversal. The Romans chose Golgotha because it was efficient, because it was near the road, because the maximum number of people would see what happened to those who challenged imperial authority. And in doing so, in placing the cross precisely where they did, they placed it in a location already loaded with multiple layers of significance that they did not understand and did not intend. The place of skulls, the ground of the cursed, the rejected section of quarry, the broken rock, outside the gate, in the garden near the tomb. Every single one of those details is doing theological work in the way the story is told. Every single one of them was already there, already embedded in the landscape, waiting. Let's talk now about what happened after. The site of Golgotha was not immediately preserved as sacred. The earliest Christians were a persecuted minority with no capacity to memorialize public spaces. They met in houses. They shared meals. They told stories about what they had seen and heard. And the place where Jesus died was, from the Roman perspective, simply a public execution site. One among many, used continuously for its intended purpose. Decades passed. In 70 CE, Rome destroyed Jerusalem. The city was razed, the temple demolished, the population killed or enslaved or scattered. What remained of the city's pre-war geography was buried under rubble, then rebuilt. Then, in 135 CE, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman city and deliberately constructed a temple to Venus, or Jupiter, sources differ, over the area Christian communities identified as the site of the crucifixion and burial. Whether this was targeted desecration or simply routine urban construction over available real estate, we cannot know with certainty. But the effect was to seal the site in place. When Constantine sent excavators in 325 CE, they demolished Hadrian's platform and found, beneath it, the tomb that had been identified by local Christian tradition, which had preserved its location through nearly 3 centuries of Roman occupation. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his Life of Constantine, describes the moment the tomb was uncovered. He uses the language of revelation, of recovery, of something hidden being brought back to light. But what was also uncovered, and this is something that the standard telling of the story often glosses over, was the rock of Golgotha itself, a section of limestone outcrop separate from the tomb that the excavators identified as the place of crucifixion. Constantine's architects incorporated it into the design of the new basilica. Today, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you can stand on the 2nd floor and touch, through an opening in the altar, the actual limestone bedrock of the site. The rock is real. The crack in the rock is real. The tomb cut into the quarry wall is real. What is buried beneath the marble and the incense and the centuries of religious architecture is a broken piece of a disused quarry. Fractured limestone, the rejected stone that the builders found unsuitable. And now, I need you to hear something. Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That verse is quoted in the New Testament more times than almost any other Old Testament passage. It appears in Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and 1 Peter. Every single time it is applied to Jesus. The rejected one becomes the foundation, the rejected stone of the quarry, the discarded section of limestone too fractured and fissured to be useful, the place where skulls accumulated and the cursed were executed and the dead were left for dogs and birds. That rejected place became the cornerstone. If you are not feeling the weight of that, the layering of it, the way the physical reality of the quarry and the theological claim of the resurrection are speaking the same language, the same metaphor, the same image, then I have not done my job. This is the secret Golgotha holds, not a hidden location, not a suppressed history, not a conspiracy. The secret is that the place was already telling the story before the story arrived. The landscape of Golgotha, the quarry, the rejection, the skulls, the garden, the broken rock, the location outside the gate in the ground of the cursed, was already, in the physical grammar of the ancient world, a place loaded with the exact meanings that the theological interpretation of the crucifixion would later require. The Romans brought Jesus there because it was efficient and public and near the road. They had no idea what they were walking into. There is one more layer, the one that, for me, is the most quietly devastating. John's Gospel, which is consistently the most precise about details of time and place, opens its prologue with a deliberate echo of the opening of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The echo of "in the beginning" is intentional. John is framing Jesus' story as a new creation narrative, and in John's account of the burial of Jesus, chapter 19, verses 41 through 42, there is a detail that does not appear in the other 3 Gospels. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. A garden. John's passion narrative ends in a garden, with a body being laid in a tomb of new, untouched earth. John's resurrection narrative begins in the same garden. Chapter 20, verses 14 through 15. Mary Magdalene, weeping outside the tomb, turns and sees someone standing there. She doesn't recognize him. She assumes he is the gardener. She said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him." She thought he was the gardener. There is extraordinary care in that detail. Whether it is symbolic or literal or both, John is placing the resurrection in a garden and giving the first witness the impression that the risen figure is someone who tends that garden. The first human in Genesis is placed in a garden, given the role of tending and keeping it. And in that garden, death enters the story. The last human in John's Gospel, the one the Gospel is arguing is the new creation, the second Adam, is encountered in a garden by a woman who mistakes him for the gardener. The Garden of Golgotha is, in John's theological imagination, the Garden of Origins, revisited. Not the same garden, the same moment. The moment where the question of the garden, of life and death, of presence and exile, of inside and outside, is answered. And it is answered in a place that was a quarry. That was discarded. That was outside the gate. That accumulated the bones of the condemned. That was called the skull. And it answers it in a place that was a quarry. That was discarded. That was outside the gate. That accumulated the bones of the condemned. That was called the skull. There's something I've been sitting with throughout all of this that I want to say plainly before we get to the last question. Every layer we've uncovered here, the quarry, the rejected stone, the skull tradition, the location outside the gate, the garden, the earthquake crack, the Adam burial, each one of these was already present in the landscape before the crucifixion. None of them were constructed after the fact to make the story fit. They were features of the physical and cultural reality of this specific place in first-century Jerusalem. The question is whether you believe that's an accident. If you believe it's an accident, if you believe the Romans stumbled onto a site whose geology, name, history, and theological position within Jewish law happened to perfectly prefigure the exact claims that would later be made about what occurred there, then Golgotha is history's most extraordinary coincidence. If you don't believe it's an accident, then the place was prepared, not constructed, not manufactured, but prepared, the way a stage is prepared before the actors arrive, not to constrain the drama, but to give it somewhere to happen that can hold its full weight. Either way, the place is remarkable. The last question I want to leave you with is this one, because it's the one I think is most honest. How do you feel about a God who chooses to make the most important thing happen in the most discarded place? Not the temple, not the palace, not even the garden of the righteous. A disused quarry outside the city gate, in a section of rejected stone too broken to be useful, in a ground historically known for its accumulated skulls. The theology of Golgotha is not a theology of triumph. It is not a theology of beauty or power or elevation. It is a theology of descent, of choosing deliberately the place that every other authority has declared unworthy. The Romans put their condemned there because the location was already worthless, already cursed, already beneath consideration. And the tradition that grew out of what happened there said, that is exactly where God was. Not above it, not observing it from a safe distance, not sending an emissary to report back. There, in the skull, in the crack in the broken rock, in the ground outside the gate where the cursed go to die. That's what Golgotha holds. That's the secret it's been sitting on for 2,000 years, while pilgrims wept on its marble floors, and armies fought over its ownership, and scholars argued about its exact coordinates. The secret was never about the location. It was about what the location means. And what it means is that there is no place too broken, too excluded, too discarded, to be the place where everything changes. If you found what we uncovered tonight inside this ancient ground worth sitting with, share it. Pass it to someone who needs to hear it. There is a video waiting for you on the screen right now that goes somewhere this story has never been taken. I'll see you there.